With more than 25 years of experience working as a school psychologist and a neuropsychologist, I have found that families and patients commonly have the same questions. Questions about how the brain works and how the diagnostic system works, and questions and frustrations about how the special education system works and how to get a child help if they're struggling in school. So that's what these presentations will be about. We're going to have one today on the diagnostic system and the brain. Then we'll have a second that focuses on the special education systems and how to navigate those and get children support when they're struggling in school. The format is as follows. I've asked patients of mine, former patients of mine, to write down questions or bring forth concepts that they found valuable during their evaluation process. And I will review those and answer those or respond to those here today. So here we go. The first question is, tell us about your experiences growing up and what led you to where you are today. Wow. Okay, so that one is clearly coming from the fact that I share a little bit too much information, I'm sure, with my families, including the fact that my path to where I am today as a neuropsychologist was far from typical. To make a very long story short, from day one, I was atypical or different or experiencing things that changed the way my brain functions, including I was very sick during my infancy. I had chronic ear infections. In fact, my parents were told that I wouldn't hear, and I didn't hear anything apparently until after 6 months of age. So that clearly changed the way my brain developed and functions today. Then going forward, it was very evident that I was going to struggle to regulate aspects of my behavior, including my movement. So in other words, I was hyperactive or clinically a spaz. That was clearly problematic in the educational setting because I had a hard time regulating my movement. And that led to me getting into trouble. Additionally, I struggled with learning. While I could read okay, I didn't understand one thing I read. And so that was clearly frustrating and sort of adding to my frustrations in the school, in addition to the fact I was getting in trouble for not sitting still and being impulsive and those types of things. And writing was even harder. Writing hurt my hand. I had a hard time generating ideas. My spelling was atrocious, and it still is. My grammar was atrocious, and it still is. So you start adding these things together, and I start to get more and more frustrated. And as I get into middle school or junior high and high school, these things just started to compound themselves because as my peers, who I felt I was just as smart as, were sort of going through the normal trajectory and working their way up through life, I was at best stagnating and commonly getting into trouble. And I quickly learned that going for the laugh would get me better attention and was much easier than going for the grade or for an academic performance. So that's what I did. I just did, in any moment, I would say or do what I thought was funny. I wasn't a bad kid. I didn't want to hurt other people's feelings or make life difficult for others, but I knew I wasn't going to shine academically, and so if I was going to get attention, I wanted it to be through humor whenever possible. So that's not always appreciated by our teachers when you're going for the laugh and trying to get other people to laugh, and therefore I was in trouble constantly. My parents were on the first name basis with many of my principals, and so that was very, very difficult, very, very frustrating, and very atypical. I think I spent more time in the principal's office than many of the principals at the schools. And so moving forward, going beyond that, real quick, not to mention, I had a sister a couple years older than me who never got an A because she only got A pluses. So she sets this really high bar, and then along comes John and just destroys that line of thinking around who my family is and what we're capable of. So that was certainly a source of embarrassment. It just, again, compounded sort of some of those underlying frustrations. So I go from there to somehow I got accepted into college, even though my parents were told 2 weeks before high school graduation I was not going to graduate unless I got all my grades up. Somehow I did that. I go to college, first one that accepted me, and I found out in college that we have to be our own executors, our own organizers, and so that certainly did not work out too well. When an assignment is due in 3 weeks, for me that meant I would start it 2 weeks, 6 days, and 23 hours from when it was due, and getting 3 weeks of work done in an hour doesn't usually result in good grades for most of us. So that was me. So I failed out, moved back home, got the sort of the prereqs out of the way, and then worked my way into the University of Colorado. Because I was starting to learn what I needed to do to be successful, and I knew it was different than most. And I needed ways to regulate my brain, and I figured out some of those ways, and some of them wouldn't be necessarily considered ideal or the ways we would necessarily want people to go to help themselves regulate, but it's what I did. So I get through the University of Colorado, a degree in psychology, and then I had an amazing experience at a psychiatric hospital in and around that Boulder area, Boulder, Colorado. And this was just so eye-opening because I had an opportunity to work with children and adolescents who had been through unbelievably traumatic scenarios, and it had really disrupted how their brains were functioning. And so therefore they had various psychological diagnoses and manifested that trauma and those brain differences in various ways that were quite significant. And so that was a very eye-opening experience. It was the best job I've ever had because it was so eye-opening, and I got to see and work with some unbelievable human beings who had had some really rough experiences. But it was also the most challenging because I spent the vast majority of every day doing physical restraints, and that's never fun to do. So I started to really obtain an understanding of what psychology was about and what happens when a brain functions or operates or develops differently. And so that Cleo Wallace experience really was profound because it prepared me for anything and everything going forward. So from there, when I came to Arizona, I entered into school psychology. Also, an absolutely amazing experience surrounded by incredible teachers and administrators, but also on the front lines of the processes related to getting support, meaning I got to see firsthand that if a child's struggling, oh my goodness, it takes forever to get the system to move. There's so many layers that parents and families have to go through to get their child the support they need. And so that became very frustrating for me because I felt like a lot of kids that had needs were not being given what they needed to be successful and happy, and these were pretty basic things that they needed. So from there I went into the private realm, into private practice, and that's where I am today. And so the thing that stands out most, and I think the reason why this question was presented, is the fact that I do share a lot of this with my families because I think it's disarming from the standpoint of I have a perspective that I think a lot of the people that in this field of mental health, psychiatry or psychology or school psychology or counseling, I think I have a perspective that many of them may not have, meaning I've kind of been there. I'm not suggesting I'm the same as anyone else, but I certainly didn't travel the typical road, and I had those frustrations, and I began to believe I was simply less capable than others. I began to believe that I wasn't intelligent, that I had limited opportunities for success. I got that message continually. And so in my practice, I can bring that forward, and I want to do that through this community as well. This idea that different is never an excuse, but it's not a bad thing. We just need to understand where those differences come from, and then we need to figure out, based on where those differences come from, which will always be the brain, we need to figure out what tools are needed to allow an individual with effort to be happy, healthy, and successful. So that was a very long-winded answer regarding my experiences, but I think it's an important foundation because that's what I bring to the table. I bring a history of experiences that were very, very frustrating, overwhelming, and led me to internal experiences that were certainly less than ideal. And I've had just about every diagnosis you can imagine thrown at me at some point. I've taken just about every medication you can take at some point. And so again, that personal experience along with the academic and practical knowledge, I think puts me in a position where I can offer a relationship with the patients I work with that maybe some others in my field cannot. So that was way too long, but hopefully there was some meaningful information in there and it gives you guys context as to who I am. So we'll go to question 2, which is, when did you know you wanted to go into the field of neuropsychology? Sort of continuing that trajectory of experience. In college, when I was at the University of Colorado, I felt like I was an intelligent individual, but I could not get myself to buckle down and really complete courses the way a lot of people could. I was surrounded by really, really bright people who were more traditionally bright and could just pick up a book, read a chapter, and go nail a test. That was not me. And so I wanted to go into medicine, and I was fascinated by the brain. And so I had to figure out a path that wasn't med school, because I knew I was not cut out for med school. I knew I wouldn't get in, to be totally honest with you, at least at that point. And so neuropsychology sort of offered me a happy medium there. It allowed me to really go into the biological and neurological sciences. And it also allowed me to use some of my experiences to really accomplish the thing I wanted to accomplish professionally, which was to help others, particularly help kids and adolescents not have some of the same frustrations or experiences I had. And so that really was my professional goal, was to help, because that's always been a part of my heart. It didn't always look that way in school because of my behavior. But it was really at that point when I decided, okay, the best medium for me between med school and helping people, because I'm not going to med school, is neuropsychology. So that's how I decided, and that was really the point in college where I decided neuropsychology was the way I was headed, which worked out really well. All right. So question 3, what is a neuropsychologist? This has 2 parts. And what does a neuropsychological evaluation involve? So a neuropsychologist, very simply, it's a branch of psychology where the individuals that utilize that paradigm or that line of thinking recognize that you cannot have a human behavior without a brain. This chair over here will never show us a behavior. The table that's holding the camera will not have a behavior. A rock doesn't have a behavior. So neuropsychology recognizes the very important and unbreakable truth that all behavior, every single one, starts in the brain. Something has to happen in the brain for you to think, for you to move, for you to have a sensation, for you to have an emotion. There's an event that takes place in the brain, and then the behavior is really the outflow of whatever that internal experience is. And so neuropsychology recognizes that. And we work first to understand what's going on in the brain. How is the brain developed, and how is it functioning, and how does that impact behavior? Because if we understand the source of something, then we're much better equipped to treat the symptoms. So the brain is always the source. The behaviors are the symptoms. In a medical model, when we have symptoms, we have a sore throat, a fever, aches and pains, or chills. Those are symptoms. But we don't get diagnosed with those symptoms, and that's one of the problems in our diagnostic system. You don't go to the doctor or medical provider and she or he tells you, you know what, I'm going to diagnose you with a sore throat, with a fever, with some chills. Here's a Tylenol, a lozenge, throw a sweatshirt on, you'll be good to go, because those are your diagnoses. They say, well, yuck, those are your symptoms, but what's causing those symptoms? Is it viral? Is it bacterial? Is it allergies? Is it a sinus infection? Because ultimately, the intervention depends on the source, not necessarily the symptoms. Symptoms tell us a lot, but source is everything. So that is neuropsychology. The brain is always the source of our behaviors. And our behaviors can communicate what's happening in the brain or communicate an internal experience. And it's really, really important that we understand that. Because so many times in my position, I hear, Johnny's behavior is not good in the classroom. Okay, granted, that behavior isn't acceptable, but behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. So why is Johnny behaving in a certain way? That's what neuropsychology tries to answer. So the second question here is, what does a neuropsychological evaluation involve? And it involves just that. We explore through various forms of data collection, medical histories, developmental histories, and standardized testing, and parent rating scales, and parent reports. So we aggregate all of that and we try to sort of paint a picture of the developmental trajectory of the brain and how the brain is currently functioning. Because again, once we understand the functional properties of the brain, we can really begin to unpack and peel back some layers related to why these behaviors are occurring. So let me give you a quick example here. Johnny is really inattentive and impulsive and distracting others during writing class. So a teacher may report to parents, Johnny's behavior is not good. He's, I've seen him write. It's not great, but it's okay. But he's really just making some bad choices. His behaviors are not ideal. And so true, right? We can't have that in the classroom. No one would argue that. But the question now is, why are those behaviors occurring? What's happening in the brain, and what might Johnny be communicating? And that's what a neuropsychological evaluation tries to figure out through cognitive testing, and social emotional rating scales, through executive measures and that sort of thing. So when we go back to Johnny and we do a neuropsychological evaluation, and we come to find out that Johnny's writing is unbelievably frustrating for him. It's painful for him. He's forming the letters. He's orienting them the wrong way, reversing letters. His spelling is poor. His grammar is poor. So this is a bright young man who has all these great ideas. And yet when he gets into writing class, he has zero opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge. And so what's really going on during those moments of inattention or impulsivity is he's communicating he's frustrated. Now, there may be other factors there, but as adults and as professionals, we always have to pull back and not just say, this is the behavior. Granted, the behavior is occurring, and this process is never about excusing behavior, but understanding why it's occurring, what's the source to begin with, so that if we want to change it, which is our goal, we want to help out the teacher and we certainly want to help out Johnny. Our goal is to change the behavior. But if we want to change behavior, we have to understand why it's occurring so we can get the right tools to the table. Johnny still has to work hard, he still has to put effort in, he still has to follow the rules. We're trying to change the behavior. But how in the world are we supposed to know how to change the behavior if we don't understand why it's happening to begin with? So once we have that connection, the brain-behavior relationship, understanding that you can't have a behavior without a brain and it communicates an internal experience, once we have more knowledge around what's happening there, then we can bring to the table ideas around what tools will be effective in helping to change that behavior. Change it for Johnny's benefit and for his teacher's benefit. Allow him to be happy, healthy, successful in ways that align with who he is in his brain, right? So that is the purpose of a neuropsychological evaluation. Again, very long-winded, but hopefully meaningful. Next question. Can you explain the brain-behavior relationship? Wow, another great question. So the brain, as complex as it is, it's perhaps the most complex system in the universe. Literally, the universe fails to exist without it. Our concept of the universe starts in our brains. So without a brain, we have no universe. I'm getting deep here and into the weeds, but nonetheless. So when it comes to the brain, as complex as it is, it actually really only has to do three things. And I think we try to make the brain way more complex than it is. The three things it has to do are, number one, it has to process sensations. As I am speaking to you, I am sending airwaves into the camera and microphone, and those are being sent through whatever device you are on. Those airwaves are being transmitted to you, those who are watching, and your ear is taking in those airwaves, your eardrum is vibrating, and your brain is processing the meaning of those airwaves or those sounds, and it's turning those sounds into words into sentences, and you are listening to and understanding what I'm saying through sound. So there's a sensation. You're also looking at me. I would assume you are, maybe you're not. I wouldn't blame you if you're not, but you're getting visual information. So your brain processes that visual information. You get sensory information through your skin and through scent. You get it even through movement. And so the one thing that is the most important thing the brain has to do is take in and process that sensory information. And then it has to integrate it and store it, right? So if when you're a 2-year-old or 1-year-old, however old kiddos are when this begins, and the family dog comes into the room, we'll say a kiddo is 1, language is emerging, and mom and dad continually point to the family pet, the dog, and say dog or doggy. So what's happening is that child is looking at the dog. He's being consistently given the sounds that are associated with that. So now his brain is starting to link the sounds with the visual information. And now, next time when the family dog comes running into the room, that child says, doggy. So the processing of sensory information, the integrating of it, and the storing of it, this is the most important thing a brain does. This is where intelligence is housed and born. This is where all of our language systems reside and are created. This is where all of our memories are created and stored. All of the important things that the brain does is created and stored in those sensory information systems. I call them the SIS systems. So that's the first thing the brain has to do, process sensory information. The second thing it has to do is regulate what it's processing. What sounds am I going to pay attention to? What sights am I going to pay attention to? What movements am I going to make? So you have a sensory processing mechanism or a sensory information system, and then you have a regulatory system or executive functioning system. I call it regulatory or executive functioning or the REF system. And so those areas are more in the front, deep, middle, and lower parts of the brain, whereas the sensory systems, just quickly here with my brain, the sensory systems reside back in these back portions. The regulatory systems are up front, in the deep middle, and down below. And essentially what the regulatory systems are doing is creating a process of exciting or activating areas of our sensory systems or inhibiting or deactivating them. And so we have a sensory information system and we have a regulatory system. What you will find in 95% of the diagnoses out there is that it is these two systems, the interaction among them. And it's usually the regulatory system that's not regulating the sensory system at levels that would be considered typical. And so these individuals have a set of experiences that can be called a variety of different things. It can be called ADHD or anxiety or depression or Tourette's or sensory processing disorder or autism spectrum disorder. But at the end of the day, what we're finding is that it's the regulatory systems that are struggling to consistently manage what's happening in the sensory systems. One important concept here is that when we're internally motivated or it's something we enjoy, that's when our regulatory and sensory systems are operating optimally. They are communicating perfectly. And this is why Johnny, who's been diagnosed with ADHD, can go 9 hours on his Xbox, never move, and give you every detail over that last 9 hours. He's remembered everything. He's planned, he's organized, he's attended, he's done an amazing job. And then you ask Johnny to sit down and do writing, and we can't get him to pick up the pencil, or he's running around the room, or he's frustrated, or he's articulating that he wants to do other things, or now his ADHD is on display. But the reality is that he can pay attention. So nothing is in an absolute form in most situations. In other words, someone diagnosed with ADHD, can they not pay attention? That's almost never the case. In fact, in most cases, they can pay attention better than most when they're internally motivated. So what that means is their regulatory systems are much more reliant on internal motivation. This does not excuse anything, but it's important we understand these concepts, because if we understand where these behaviors are coming from, now we can start to unpack what do we need to do to get Johnny to do the things he needs to do. Because as we all know, most of reality is not super motivating. We're not super excited to do most of what we do every day. There are a few things in our lives that we find very motivating, very interesting, very intriguing, and we are different humans when we're engaged in those things that are internally motivating. Quick example there would be if I ran a psychological experiment on you and I said, look, I need you for a total of 4 hours, and all you're going to do in this experiment is watch 2 movies for me. That's it. It's pretty easy, and you'll get a little $500 or whatever it may be to participate in our experiment. And so all you got to do is watch 2 different movies. That's it, for a total of 4 hours. Movies will be the same length. So the first movie I put on, let's just say for the purposes of this example, it's a movie you haven't seen it before, but you love it. It's absolutely amazing, great plot, great visuals, great auditory, great soundtrack. You just love it. Everything's amazing. And I'm a psychologist, and I'm in the background looking, observing you through a 2-way mirror. And I'm taking notes. Oh my goodness, this experimentee A is doing a really good job paying attention. They're really focused. They seem to really be well regulated. They're doing an amazing job. Great. So first movie's over. We put the second movie on, same length of time, 2 hours, and it's a total disaster. It's the worst thing you've ever seen. I always joke, it's 2 hours of the Kardashians, just everything that's wrong with humanity and the world. But you have to sit there and watch it. Now, again, you don't know this, but I'm watching you through a 2-way mirror, and I'm observing your behaviors. I'm going to see a very different human being. Oh my God, they're back on their cell phone. Are they making their grocery list? They're up and going to the bathroom once again. Wow, they're back to the snack table. They are looking around. And so that person, I would say, well, they are really dysregulated. They're doing a terrible job of regulating. They need to be paying attention here. Now, in this same experiment, I test you on movie A, the one you loved. It was motivating. You ace it. You get 10 out of 10. I test you on movie 2. And you get 5 out of 10, 50%. You bomb it. What happened in that scenario? Well, you're the same human. I was looking at the same human being. I was looking at the same brain. I was looking at the same development, the same functioning. The variable, so the constant in that equation was the individual. The variable was their level of internal motivation. I saw a totally different human being when they were internally motivated in terms of their capacities for regulation, in terms of their capacities for learning, because regulation is required for all the things we want to do in our lives. And so this exemplifies this idea that sensory and regulatory systems must communicate constantly. But that communication is so much easier when we are internally motivated by something. This is why you see individuals who are diagnosed with ADHD, as an example. It's not that they can't pay attention, but their attention is so much more dependent on the internal motivation, the value of the activity. Again, this is not to excuse the behavior, say, well, they have ADHD, so we have to make everything just so motivating. We can't do that, and everyone has to get through life and navigate this sort of typical world. But there are things that we can do to ensure we don't at least make things less motivating than they already are. So we can use different behavioral principles that are actually neurological in nature. Any behavior has to have a brain that precedes it. We can use behavioral principles that are neurological in nature to ensure that we at least don't diminish motivation, and we can actually enhance motivation for learning and self-regulation through various means. All things we'll talk about in great detail through this community. The final thing I'll say in this area, way too long-winded here, as usual from my brain, which doesn't regulate very well, is when we're looking at diagnoses, whether it's ADHD, let me backtrack. So what we're really talking about with diagnoses here is we're talking about a regulatory continuum. The further you go down this continuum, the harder it is for that individual's regulatory system to manage their sensory system. And the further you go down on this regulatory continuum, the more likely it is you are to be diagnosed with these various labels that we've created, which are rather ridiculous. As an example, if you're just sort of having difficulties regulating during certain instances, you're a little distracted internally when it's not motivating, they're going to throw ADHD at you. Now, if you're having a difficult time regulating your motor output, they're going to throw ADHD combined presentation, hyperactive and impulsive. So we're moving down this regulatory continuum. We've passed over ADHD. Now, as you go down this continuum, and by the way, typically as we go further down the regulatory continuum, we're actually talking about advanced levels of thinking or intelligence. So this is not intended to be negative because what we're talking about is the further you are down this regulatory continuum, the harder it is for your brain to regulate the sensory systems. You need sensory activity to think. So lo and behold, lots of sensory activity is commonly associated with being very bright or high levels of thinking. So this isn't necessarily negative, but as we roll down this regulatory continuum, we've passed over ADHD. Now we might start to see repetitive movements. So people that are bright or really good athletes are much more likely to have tics. We all have tics. Your blinking is a tic. We'll talk more about that later. So tics are not bad. That's one of the issues with psychology and psychiatry is we've come to associate any term in these fields with something pathological. And it makes sense because the book says mental illness or mental disorder. So as we traverse this regulatory continuum, we've passed ADHD, we might start to see tics or repetitive movements or hyperactivity. Now we're going to start to see the sensory aspects of this, sensory dysregulation. These might be individuals that they can't have tags on their clothing. Their socks have to be a certain way. Food textures are incredibly important for these individuals. They won't eat certain foods. Scents, where other people are like, wow, that doesn't smell good. These people might be like, oh my, I'm going to throw up. This is so bad. Or they might smell something or feel something like, oh my gosh, that is so amazing. So everything in their sensory system is more powerful for them because their regulatory system is having a harder time managing it. Knowing that our sensory systems are responsible for thinking or cognition, people that are further down this continuum have more powerful thoughts. What's a more powerful thought? It's a thought that can get stuck. So some thought enters the brain and the regulatory system has a harder time turning it off. So what might we call this in the clinical world? This is where we come up with terms like anxiety or OCD. What is OCD? An obsession is a thought. A compulsion is a motor response that puts inhibitory chemicals or calming neurochemicals on the brain that allow us to turn off that thought for a short period of time. So an obsession is a powerful thought. A compulsion is a behavioral response, usually through some sensory activity we're doing, sensory motor. We turn off the stove and we take a picture because we were stuck on the idea that we left the stove on. So the thought was, oh my goodness, I left the stove on, the house is going to burn down. That was the obsession. The compulsion is the motoric or sensory motor response. We go and we manually and very firmly turn the oven to off. Maybe we even take a picture. Now the brain, the regulatory system has the inhibitory neurochemicals to turn off that thought for a little while. So if you are brighter, you're much more likely to be diagnosed with tics, anxiety, OCD. And now having a very active sensory system can be exhausting. Again, we're talking about typically higher levels of intelligence. And what a lot of times we see is these people, when a thought sticks, they can't get rid of it, or they're more existential. What is my role in the world? Or they become exhausted by the activity of their sensory system. And so then a psychologist, psychiatrist, whomever steps in and says, well, that sounds like depression. That sounds like anxiety. That sounds like I think it's anxiety with some ADHD. The reality is, none of those are real, and we'll talk about that in the near future. What is real is that anyone diagnosed with ADHD, anxiety, depression, autism spectrum disorder, whatever it is along that continuum, the one thing I can promise you, even if people, a psychiatrist or a psychologist disagree, which one is it? What I can promise you is all of those people have a brain, and that brain's working differently for that person. And so therefore, that's why we want to take a step back. We want to start with what's happening in the brain so that we can understand the behaviors so that we have the right tools. I'll end on this one with sort of this idea of going down that regulatory sensory continuum. The further down we go, the more likely it is we are going to be diagnosed with these conditions. If you are very bright, you or someone around you has at some point said, oh, geez, you might have ADHD, or maybe you have anxiety and some OCD, or geez, do you have depression? Or you've thought that yourself because your sensory system is simply more powerful and the regulatory system's having a harder time managing it. And so that's why as you move down this continuum, these various diagnoses can be put into play. And then who's right? Is it anxiety or is it depression? Is this ADHD or is this Tourette's? It's just a brain, and that's all it's ever been. And so since I am 1,000 miles off into the weeds here, and which I do commonly, so we have that sensory system. An hour ago, there was a question about the brain, or I was going into the brain. So we have the sensory information systems, we have the regulatory or executive functioning systems, and then we have the motor output systems, movement. Movement is the only way you will ever know another person's internal experiences in terms of what they're thinking or what they're feeling. There can never be a way to know another person's thoughts, another person's emotions, what they're experiencing in their sensory world. There's no way to know their experiences without movement. My speaking is nothing more than movement. I am moving air out of my lungs, I'm vibrating my vocal cords, I'm moving my lips and tongue, I am sending airwaves your way. And now you have some indication of what I might be thinking, and you're able to experience my internal state at some level. The issue with our movement system, so we have sensory information systems, we have regulatory or executive functioning systems, and we have movement output systems. The tricky part with the movement output systems is we can use movement to fool people. And a lot of good people do, including most of the kids I work with. They are fooling the world in terms of what their internal experiences are. What do I mean by this? By fooling, what I mean is they are regulating. They're burning through their energy to regulate. Why? Because these are wonderful human beings with hearts of solid gold that want to do the right thing. So when I'm working with a child or an adolescent, whomever it may be, I'm looking at the totality of their behaviors, and I'm trying to look through the lens of neurologically what's happening and what might they be communicating through those behaviors. And so if I see a child who's constantly seeking sensory inputs, well, I know that what they're trying to do is find things that have a positive value in terms of touch that are calming for them. So they're actively trying to regulate their brain because they know the expectation is they get through these series of tests and that they work with me. Now, I don't require a child sit there, you will sit there for the whole time, crisscross applesauce, you'll have your hands on the desk, zero chance. Because I want access to their entire brain, and their movement is the only thing that gives me full access to that. So what we end up seeing is a lot of human beings try to regulate because they want to please teachers, they want to please parents, they want to please the psychologist in front of them. But you can see that they're running low on brain energy to inhibit. And then at a certain point, their ability to inhibit starts to go down and their activity or dysregulation goes up. So I never look at these things through a point of judgment, but through a point of understanding what's happening in the brain. And so many human beings out there, adults and kids. You've got Janie here, who's just a total sweetheart. All her teachers love her, but she is just constantly consumed by thoughts internally. But she regulates those, so she doesn't show her teachers that she is just overwhelmed by the idea she might have to read out loud in class. So the teacher's up at the front of the room talking. All Janie can think about is, oh my gosh, I hope I don't get called on. I don't want to read out loud in class. So she's not really taking in a lot of the information because her brain is way more active than others. She's frustrated by reading. She's embarrassed by it. So when she gets called on to answer a question, even if she doesn't have to read out loud in class, she might go, what? I'm sorry, you asked me a question. What was the question again? She may not have any idea of what was happening in the classroom because there's so much going on in her brain. Now, because she's not running around the room or getting into people's way or super impulsive, we assume Janie's great. She's cute, she's regulated, she's smart. We all love her. She does all her homework. She works really hard. So everything's great with Janie. Not saying anything's wrong with Janie, but the reality is her internal experience may be very different. It oftentimes is very different than what people show, especially good people will regulate. So you have no idea what they're actually experiencing. This is where neuropsychology comes in, and it's critical that we understand that a person's movement is all we ever have access to. So if I were to ask you right now, what are you thinking of this presentation? Is it interesting? Are you finding it meaningful? Are you getting good information out of it? Well, I've activated your sensory systems, and your regulatory system's going to try to jump in there and cooperate, because in your sensory systems, you have a socially appropriate response file. So even though you might be thinking, oh my gosh, this guy is all over the place, he's gone 1,000 different directions, and I have no idea what he's talking about because he can't seem to hold a linear thought, you respond, your motor output system pulls out, your regulatory system pulls out of the social file, and your motor output system says, this is great, really interesting, you're doing a great job, really appreciate this, wow, wonderful job. When you're actually thinking this is a total disaster. But in my view, through movement, my assumption is they're loving this, I'm crushing this, you're really getting a lot out of this, fantastic, things are going great because you seem interested, you look interested. You're just regulating, you went into your social file, and through your motor output system, you told me a reality, you expressed a reality that wasn't true, that wasn't your actual reality. And people do this all the time. Humanity and psychology and psychiatry and educational systems have to start understanding this idea that our behaviors are a reflection of our internal experiences. I kind of want to replace behavior with experience, internal experiences. And since you can't have a behavior without a brain, what we really need to do is, number one, understand the brain that precedes the behavior. And then secondarily, what might that behavior be communicating? Because in many cases, we want to change the behavior. No one wants to feel anxious. No one wants to struggle with reading. No one wants to struggle with writing. No one wants to do things that diminish their opportunities for success. So if our role is to figure out what tools are needed, still have to work hard. That's part of the toolkit, and that's part of the expectation. So learning is an outcome and effort is an expectation, and the expectation of effort never goes away. So effort always stays in this, but what tools will be most effective when this person puts in effort to get to the success that they desire and deserve, success that aligns with who they are in terms of their intelligence, their heart, their goals. That's what neuropsychology is about fundamentally, and that's where we really need a paradigm shift in all of society, away from this idea that behavior is its own thing and that we can put labels on it which will tell us what tools are needed. What we need to do is fundamentally look at what's happening in the brain, what might impact development and functioning, what are we seeing as a result, and now what tools, when someone applies effort and follows the rules, what tools will align with that person's brain to get them to success. It's critical that we get there, and that literally is the reason I'm keeping the Understanding Exceptional project going, because I want to promote on a large scale level a shift in our thinking around psychology, psychiatry, education. Not a shift away from responsibility or effort, but a shift into the idea that using different tools to get to success can be a game changer for different individuals, particularly those of us who roll a little bit differently. So, all right, that was way too long. And next question is, what does neurodivergent mean? Wow, I just spent 7.5 hours on that one, so I won't be too redundant here, which because of my regulatory system, I'm oftentimes very, very redundant. So neurodivergent is exactly that. These are individuals who some aspect of their sensory information systems, regulatory, executive functioning systems, and motor output systems have developed and operate differently, period. I'm not here to change anyone's definition or to give you this is what it is, but neurodivergent should be conceptualized. It's kind of entered into society, and I actually really like the term. I'm generally not a fluffy guy. But I think this term is really, really powerful because it's spot on. It's not neurodisabled, neurodisordered. It's not neurodamaged or neuroillness. It's neurodivergent. There are exceptions, but in most cases, a diagnosis, a psychological diagnosis, is a reflection of a brain that has developed and is operating differently in that moment, leading to different experiences and or behaviors. And so if we got away from the idea that everything that a psychologist, psychiatrist, school psychologist, school system, every word they give you is pathological. It means you're broken, you have a disorder, you have a disability, there's something wrong. That's not accurate. There's something different. And those differences are beautiful in many cases, and in many cases, they are disruptive because we've created a world for what I call the Honda brain, right? Just a brain that kind of operates the same. It is open to consistent curriculums for reading, writing, and math. The Honda brain, the world's built for the Hondas because, 75%, whatever the number may be, of those on this planet have Hondas for brain systems, right? So you can take your Honda anywhere. You can take it to any gas station, any mechanic. So if you have a Honda type brain, you're in good shape because the world's built for you. Everyone has their ups and downs. But generally speaking, I don't see Hondas at my practice because they're generally very functional in the world built for the typical neurotypical brain, Honda. I work with Ferraris, brains that are just built differently. Is a Ferrari broken? Is it damaged? Is it disordered, disabled? Is it mentally ill? No, not at all, frankly. In fact, these are individuals almost always, in every case, no matter the diagnosis, these individuals have unbelievable skills in certain areas because they just have brains that are built differently. So the Ferrari requires a whole different toolkit. And that's where I see my job. My job is to work with families and patients to identify what tools are going to be best in working with this vehicle, this life vehicle, the brain that you've been given. Because how is this life vehicle impacting your internal experiences and your external behaviors? We need to figure out what is that bridge so that we can get the right tools. Still have to work hard, follow the rules, but what are the tools that match with your brain so that your efforts lead to your successes? And so neurodivergent is anyone that falls into that Ferrari brain scenario, a brain that is just wired differently. It is developed differently, not in a broken way, not in a damaged or disordered way, but in a different way. And of course, there are exceptions, and there are ends to this continuum where the experiences for the individual can be very different and very, very problematic, or the sensory systems develop differently, and on and on and on. But in most situations, a diagnosis should really reflect the idea that there's a difference of development and functioning that leads to different experiences and therefore different behaviors. Neurotypical, pretty darn typical brain, a Honda. Neurodivergent, a Ferrari. So hopefully that's helpful here. Let me go into the next question here. My child was first diagnosed with ADHD, then anxiety was added, then sensory processing disorder, then OCD, and finally autism spectrum disorder. Why does this happen? Well, going back to that protracted and probably pretty boring discussion I had on the regulatory continuum, it's all there. We have three things that the brain must do. It must process sensory information. It must integrate it, then store it. But there's a sensory area, there's a regulatory area, and then there's the wheels, the motor output system, right? So if we're using a metaphor of the life vehicle, the sensory system would be the engine, the regulatory system would be your driver, and the motor output system would be your wheels. Engine's the most important part of any vehicle. Got to have a driver, though, to navigate this thing, and the wheels show us what's happening between the interaction between the engine and the driver, right? So as you traverse this continuum, you go further and further down. The harder it is for your brain, your regulatory systems, to manage the activity of your sensory systems, the further you're going to fall on this continuum. And so at the one end, you have things like ADHD, and then as it becomes harder, you have things like repetitive movements or potentially overactivity. Then you start talking about things like maybe there's some repetitive movements or stereotype movements or repetitive behaviors. Then you start talking about things like repetitive thought patterns or perseveration, and they have 35 different terms for the exact same neurological event that's a behavior, a movement system, like things like, is this perseveration, or is this more of an obsession, or is this repetitive thing? It's all the same. It's once a powerful thought gets locked in, it's hard to regulate or inhibit that thought. So as we go down this continuum, we kind of pass over ADHD, we start passing into overactivity or movement differences. We start talking about sensory processing differences. The sounds, certain sounds are very, very dysregulating. Certain sounds are very regulating. Certain textures are very dysregulating. Certain textures are very regulating, because that sensory experience is at a greater volume. So the things that are uncomfortable or aversive are way more aversive or uncomfortable. And the things that are calming or regulating are way more calming and way more regulating. So which is why you see people seeking sensations and avoiding sensations. And that's, as we traverse this continuum, that's a part of that. And then we start talking about, well, those repetitive thought patterns, that's anxiety or that's OCD. And now we have emotions that follow, because once your regulatory system can no longer manage what's happening in the sensory system, you will get emotional. An example being, if I was to pinch you sequentially harder and harder and harder, when I am not pinching you, you have no reason to attend to that area of your skin. That area is very regulated. Conversely, as someone gets pinched harder and harder and harder, eventually they're going to get to a point where pain kicks in. That sensory system is going to kick off the regulatory system, and we're going to be sensory and motor only, or fight or flight. You're going to pull your arm away from me, go, ow, get the heck away from me. Why did you do that? That hurt. Don't you dare do that again. And if I look at you in that moment and say, geez, you're being emotional, I'm not pinching you right now, chill out, that doesn't do any good, because what's happened is your regulatory system couldn't manage the sensory inputs, the pain. So it kicked the regulatory system off. You're kind of in a fight or flight state, and now you're just movement and sensation in that moment, or emotion, right? It's very hard to regulate emotions. You know, you commonly hear parents, and for all of us, when they're in an emotional state, I can't rationalize with them. I can't talk them down. I can't help them get to a point of regulation. And there's a reason for this. So we can help kids get there, and humans, adults too. But we got to understand what emotions are if we're going to have the right tools in hand. So as we go down this regulatory continuum, we pass over sensory. So we've passed ADHD. So we need those tools. We've passed movement. So those tools might be effective. We passed sensory. Those tools might be effective. We passed anxiety. We passed depression. Potentially, or this emotional piece. And so once we get to a point where that internal experience is so overwhelming that it impacts socialization, a child's ability to engage their peers or to understand the perspective. There's so much going on back here in my sensory system that I got to pay attention to what's happening internally. And so the external world's a little bit harder for me to grab onto, because I just don't have the capacity for perspective taking in this moment. No one chooses to be this way. This is not a situation where someone is just, I just choose not to do this. These are individuals who are so overwhelmed by the activity of their sensory system that it's harder for them to understand the experiences of others, because they have to pay attention to their own, because that's part of survival. So once we cross over into this idea that social communication, perspective taking goals or therapies or tools might be helpful, now we have to consider autism spectrum disorder. And there's all kinds of complications with autism spectrum disorder, which I don't know if we'll get to that later today or not, but certainly we will through the Understanding Exceptional community. But the reality is that that as we talk about the regulatory continuum, any diagnosis we pass over, we might benefit from those tools. That's not to say, every kid with that's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder should be on Ritalin, because that's how we treat ADHD. No chance. In fact, pharmaceuticals is a disaster too. We'll talk more about that. But the reality is that structural interventions related to paying attention, or environmental interventions related to self-regulation and organization absolutely might be helpful for those kids that have been diagnosed with autism. And so the further we go down this regulatory continuum, the more likely it is that an individual might benefit from tools associated with diagnoses. And that's one of the biggest issues we have with the diagnostic system, is that we only look at the symptoms. Then we say, well, ADHD is the diagnosis, so that's treated with Ritalin. And I cannot tell you how many times I've had individuals in my practice. We'll go back to Johnny. Johnny's been diagnosed with ADHD, and everyone agrees. Struggles to pay attention, can be impulsive at times, struggles with organization, can be emotional, all of those things. ADHD, we're just going through the checklist. But since we didn't really look at the source, which has to be the brain and what's going on in the brain, when we go straight from behavior to diagnosis to intervention, we go ADHD to Ritalin or whatever it is, and Johnny's on Ritalin, it's still not working, and a parent arrives and has an evaluation, I say we're going to get rid of those words. Those words aren't meaningful. We know Johnny has brain, so let's start there. And come to find out more times than you can possibly imagine that Johnny, who's being treated with Ritalin, never needed Ritalin. He's undiagnosed type 1 diabetic. So Johnny needed insulin, never Ritalin. The problem being the symptoms of untreated type 1 diabetes, the impact that has on the brain, cause absolute dysregulation in many people. And so the behaviors look ADHD, the treatment for ADHD is Ritalin. We've done Johnny no favors by putting him on Ritalin when he needed insulin all along. And there are different ways for his brain to recalibrate itself. This idea that we go from symptoms, 15 minutes with the psychiatrist, he asks you about the symptoms, maybe has you do a checklist. You get a diagnosis of ADHD for your child, you leave with a prescription for Ritalin is absolutely unacceptable, and it needs to change. This is not to say medications aren't helpful for in many cases, but the reality is medication should always be the last result, and there are natural mechanisms for brain recalibration to bring a balance between that sensory and regulatory system, and so that we achieve the goals we want to achieve without just saying, hey, it's ADHD, throw some Ritalin in the tank. Don't do Johnny any favors by doing it that way, and it's never his family's fault, I promise you. They're the ones saying, is there a different way we can do this? But it's impacting him, so we need to do it. Teachers are saying ADHD, the system is saying it, so that's Ritalin. It's really, really egregious. So the further you go down the regulatory continuum, the more likely you are to exhibit these things, which is why the question was 4.5 hours ago when I started my response. This is why your child was first diagnosed with ADHD, and then anxiety was added, and then sensory processing disorder was added, and then obsessive compulsive disorder was added. And then finally, sort of the overarching capturing of all of that dysregulation is found in autism spectrum disorder, which we'll talk more about later. So hopefully that provides an answer to your question there. So next question. You explained to our family that the diagnostic system is broken. Can you tell us more about why you tell your families this and what you mean? Well, in my tangential answers to all of these questions, I've kind of gone into that, but it's such an important point. I'll unpack it just a little bit here. The diagnostic system is fundamentally broken because the people that operate the diagnostic system, the people that work within the diagnostic system, psychiatrists, psychologists, special education professionals, those operators of the diagnostic systems use diagnostic criteria that are symptom-based. It is the diagnostic system itself that is broken. These are not bad individuals, but the system we set up is a symptom-based system, which is why psychiatrists or psychologists may argue over what the exact diagnosis is. You may take your child to 2 different psychologists and you have 2 totally different diagnostic outcomes. How is that possible? Who's right? The reason is because the diagnostic system, ADHD, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, autism spectrum disorder, dyslexia, dysgraphia, go on and on and on. All of these things the criteria are behaviorally based. What does the evaluator see in that short interval of time? What do the rating scales say? So what do we call this thing? Now, the important thing to remember here is that in the history of mankind, no one's ever been diagnosed with ADHD based on a cheek swab. No one's ever been diagnosed with Tourette's based upon a blood test. No one's ever been diagnosed with dyslexia based on a hair follicle sample. Now, there are places out there that will tell you we can do this objectively in using physiological methods, whether it's brain scans or whatnot. While there's been some advances, the reality is they're not there yet. And the more important reality is that these diagnoses are just You're trying to jam symptoms that you see, that the practitioner sees, into a box or a label so that we know what to do. Johnny is showing me ADHD. He's right in front of me. He's impulsive. He's not really paying attention like I need him to. He's a little more active. That's ADHD. It's easy. It's all right there. Let's get this kiddo on Ritalin. The problem there being that diagnosis was made based on the movement systems. And that's the only thing that practitioners have access to. Psychologists, psychiatrists, special education professionals. The only thing they will ever have access to is the individual's movement, right? So they see that Johnny is overactive, so that's ADHD. But the reality is he's overactive because the calibration of his brain is being impacted because he hasn't been properly diagnosed medically with type 1 diabetes. Once we get that medical scenario taken care of and we get the brain recalibrated and functioning properly, all of a sudden the regulatory capacity for Johnny goes way up. So the diagnostic system relies solely on symptoms. It is a symptom-based system. And the unfortunate part is too many of the people in these systems that diagnose are very, very certain that they have all the answers. They know what your child is experiencing. They know what you are experiencing, and they don't. There's no chance they do. I don't know what you're experiencing if you come to see me. I'm relying on your behaviors and what you tell me and what you explain to me. So when it's a kid, I can look at their behaviors and extrapolate from that what might be happening. Parents are always their kids' best medical doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, teachers. You parents are always you're their experts. I promise you, more than anyone in any system, medical system, neurological system, educational, you're the best. I promise you as parents, always remember that. But what we can do is when we see those things behaviorally that are problematic, we want to figure out the source, the brain, what's going on in the brain and what experience are they communicating? And the diagnostic system doesn't do that. It fundamentally, I don't know how, it has fundamentally ignored that. So at the end of the day, when we're arguing, well, is this ADHD with anxiety, or is this more anxiety with ADHD, or is this depression and ADHD with a little bit? For me, it's none of those, because we didn't do anything objective to get to those words. What it is a brain. We know that for sure. And it's an experience that's impacted by that brain. And so knowing the brain experiential and behavioral relationship, let's talk about what tools might be effective. If somebody's showing us sort of more classically anxious type behaviors, well, there's tools for that, absolutely. But can we definitively say it's anxiety and not depression, or is it depression first? Then we can't, because there's nothing objective. No blood draws, no hair follicle tests, nothing like that. So it's the diagnostic system that has been flawed since its inception, and it needs to change. I'm not saying that these experiences for individuals are pleasant. Absolutely they are not. And I'm not saying we shouldn't still sort of conceptualize behaviors in the ways we used to look at it. But we need to fundamentally change our approach to support. And we need to recognize none of those words can exist without a brain. So let's absolutely start there. And I think that's super important. And that is maybe the foundation of understanding exceptional. It's that changing systems, how they think, how they operate, so that we can have the right tools to change the human experience for the better, because we all deserve that. If we put in effort, we should be able to use that effort to get to the success, the outcomes. We should have the levels of achievement that we desire and we deserve. That's the only thing that's fair. As long as we put that effort in, we should be entitled to success. All right, next one. I've heard others use the term diagnosis shopping. What does the term diagnosis shopping mean? Interesting question. It is a term that's out there, and this is sort of rolls back into the diagnostic flaws or the systemic flaws with diagnosis. So diagnosis shopping in its just rawest form really is referring to parents usually who are trying to find a diagnosis to get their child support, right? Now, many people would view diagnosis shopping as something very negative, as a pejorative of some type. You know, so-and-so wants something wrong with their child. I don't think in my 25 plus years, I don't think I've ever worked with a parent that wants something to be wrong with their child. What's happened is we've created a system that says the words are the tools. And what I have and what I've always experienced and encountered in my practice is I have parents that know Johnny or Janie is operating differently, and therefore their behaviors or their experiences are different. And they know that different tools might be helpful. And so parents aren't really diagnosis shopping as much as service seeking. And there's a very distinct difference. Diagnosis shopping would imply that somebody wants something wrong. No parent wants something wrong with their child. What parents all want, and frankly, you're not a good parent if you don't want this, what parents want is they want access to the tools that will allow their child to be successful. And like I had said earlier, you are your child's best expert in all areas. You know their brains. Because you will know better than the medical doctors, the neurologists, the teachers, the psychologist, what your child's experiences are. The only person that knows more about your child's inner experiences than you as parents is your child. That's it. But when we're young, when we're kids, we can't really put words to it. So we rely on the professionals to help us out. Things are rolling out differently for me, so what's available to me to help me be successful? So that's diagnosis shopping should be a term that we get rid of, because it implies that a diagnosis is, or that parents are seeking something negative, and they aren't. The final aspect of this is the problem being that the system has set it up so certain words get you certain tools. And this, in many cases, explains why there's been an explosion of certain diagnoses. Let's take autism spectrum disorder. Now, I'm not for 1 minute saying those diagnosed with autism don't have it. I'm not exactly sure what it is. That's a whole different discussion, because there isn't a clear, singular definition. So I'm not suggesting that anyone that's been diagnosed with autism shouldn't have that diagnosis, or that doesn't have a real impact on who they are. Clearly, their brains are operating differently in many wonderful ways, I would guess, but they're operating differently. The behaviors are therefore different. We need different tools. So when it comes to the system itself, well, as an example, through the federal system of education, certain words, and we'll discuss this in the second seminar that's forthcoming here that will happen tomorrow on special education. But in the special education system, what they've done is they've set it up so certain words or eligibilities, special education eligibilities, are not exactly the same as the words we use in psychology or psychiatry, but certain words get certain tools. And so as an example, through the federal criteria, at least here in the state of Arizona, I could diagnose a child with ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, same child, depression, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, which are reading, writing, and math disorders. So we've got 6 different diagnoses. That's a lot. This poor kiddo is struggling, right? So we know there's a lot in the toolkit we might want to use, or a lot of tools we might want to put in there. We have 6 different diagnoses. Well, in the state of Arizona, that's approximately $6,000 extra to support that child. Now, the moment somebody says autism, that $6,000 goes to $30,000. So are parents really seeking a diagnosis as much as they're seeking services, and the services that their children need? I say it is absolutely a byproduct of these parents are seeking services, not diagnoses. But we've set up a system where the diagnosis equals the services. So the people that have set the system up have created this system, and parents are simply trying to navigate it. And it's the responsibility of psychologists, psychiatrists, to first and foremost, it is our oath to help anyone and everyone that we can in any way and every way we can. We don't want to do more than they need. We don't want to put unnecessary stuff in the toolkit. We don't want to include unnecessary diagnoses. But we darn well better include the diagnoses that get that child anything and everything they need to be successful, as determined through an evaluation. So if they need sensory supports, and they need social supports, and they need regulatory supports or they may need curriculum supports, well, there'll be certain words clinically and in the educational system that will get them those supports and other ones won't. So parents are seeking the words that get their kids the things they need to be successful. And I applaud these parents. I certainly don't look at this as diagnosis shopping, but much more so as service seeking. And that presents a whole bunch of complications, which we'll address at some other time. But that's a really interesting question.